Thank you, Maddie. Thank you. Hello, everyone. You guys really inspired me last night to try something different today, so I'm not going to talk about myself and my work very much. I want to talk about power today, and while I'm supposed to be here to inspire you, I have to admit that I was desperate to come here this weekend because I need so much to be inspired by you. And last night, hearing you all stand up and speak about your motivations and your passion and what lights you up was just so much hope for me. And this organization, Teens Turning Green, has for so many years been the wind at my back. And I always like to tell this story 10 years ago when I was, 10 years ago, this year, when I was writing my book, The Ugly Side of the Beauty Industry, I was having such a bad time of like, I can't go forward, this is too hard, like I had no social life at that point. I was despondent, depressed, disconnected. And I got invited to a Turning Green event, and I sort of dragged my sad self across the bridge and went to this event in San Francisco at Union Square. And when I got there, I just saw something that just changed everything for me. And it was 20 students standing on stage, dressed in prom dresses and combat boots, talking about toxic chemicals and personal care products, and Erin at the microphone yelling, "We are going to kick the crap out of the $50 billion beauty industry." And here's a picture of Erin in my book. And you know, Erin, I realized it's on the page that says, "Giving the government a makeover." So we had foreseen 10 years ago that you were going to take this role. And seeing Erin grow from a teenage girl in combat boots to the woman who stood before us last night and just rocked the house is just so awesome to me. That was really a woman stepping into your power and your voice. And I just think and dream, how can we reach every girl in the world to help her find her voice and find her power and speak her truth? And that's the teaching from this organization to me, for all of you to me. And that's the hope for our world. And I also was inspired to speak my dream. And I said this actually for the first time yesterday. I spoke in San Francisco to a group of people who are working around the world to clean up their communities from toxic chemical assaults. People from 50 countries, and we had a panel on women's rights. And the organizers kept saying, "This is an experiment. We're kind of nervous about this, you know, putting women's rights out there. It's sort of funny to think about, but like sometimes we have a hard time finding language to talk about these imbalances in our society." And so I spoke my dream at this event, and I said, you know, I want to organize women on a heart level, on a personal level, into a global political force to stand up for life. Like, imagine that. What is a political agenda about life? What does that look like? What are the words that we can put to it? An agenda for the life and rights of women and children. And so, you know, I have to admit that that dream feels sort of tattered and bruised since last week. And really hard, like impossible, but I know it's not impossible. But I want to speak about politics in a way that's maybe impolite and say, like, I can't wrap my head around the fact that the majority of white women in this country voted for a man who openly denigrates the value of women and the right to life for future generations. So what are we going to do about that? And I don't have the answers, but I'm bringing this question to all of you to say, how can we figure it out? And this is not just the US, it's a global phenomenon of fascism coming into power. You know, the activists in France are saying we're not going to be able to stop Le Pen now with this, you know, inspiration coming from the US for white nationalism. And in Turkey and in China and all around the world, this sort of fear-based reaction to the problems of the world is coming forth in politics. So what can we do about that? And Samantha Bee, I thought, had a really good rant after the election in which she said, we white people have to clean up our own shit. And if we're going to say that Muslims are responsible for all terrorists, like, we have to say, what are we going to do about white people? And for me, my community, white women. So I don't know, but Aaron reminded me last night of a really important quote I think that we should all be talking about and writing about, which is what Martin Luther King said, that it's not the KKK we have to worry about. It's the white conservatives who see, or the white moderates who see a goal and don't think it matters how we get there. So how do we confront those ideas in our own communities? And for me, I've been thinking about just how do I get more local? How do I get more coming from my heart and more connected in my own community to stand up against racism, against sexism, which is everywhere. Everywhere, even in environmental groups, even in the progressive movement. How can we put language to it? How can we talk about it with each other? Stand up for healing, stand up for hope. So I wanted to tell you a story about that. It gave me great hope. I had to write it down. It's a story from the Washington Post about Derek Black. Is anyone familiar with that name? Derek Black. He was a white nationalist whose dad started the largest white nationalism website in the country, Stormfront, and he's a protege of David Duke. His mom was actually married to David Duke. And this guy, he had been taught, I'm just going to read this from the Washington Post article. Derek had been taught that America was intended as a place for white Europeans and that everyone else would eventually have to leave. He was taught to be suspicious of other races, of the US government, of tap water and pop culture. Now, I was also thinking, like, when I think about getting personal in my own life and where can I confront what my teachings have been around politics, and I heard a few of you say this to me last night too, that this sort of culture of it's impolite to talk about politics. Does anyone have that in their families? Not too many, that's good. I grew up in north of Boston, more people raising their hands. I grew up north of Boston in a sort of second and third generation immigrant community, mostly from Ireland, Italy, Poland, and Greece. And it was very much like this don't rock the boat kind of culture in our families. Like, we're just assimilating, we're just fitting in. It's not polite to talk about politics, it's not polite to talk about religion. So my parents would vote. They would only vote because I was the kid who dragged them to the polls. Like, I was so excited about voting. Only because I had a neighbor who dragged me out to leaflet for the Democrats when I was in first grade. And I used to march around, go like, vote for the Democrats, and people would say, like, why? I'm like, wow, that's a challenge. Well, because they want to give more money to schools. Okay, that's a good reason. So I got so fired up about politics, and people thought, of course, oh, cute little kid. They were really, I got positive energy from this activism. So I took that to my parents, and I dragged them to the polls, and they would vote because I made them, but they would never tell me who they voted for because it's not polite. We don't talk about that. There were no dinner discussions around politics. So I just want to name that and confront it and say, for me, like, taking that on is one of the ways that I want to get more local, more from my heart and more connected, is to have those conversations in my family about, like, that's not okay. Because you know who is not having that attitude with their kids? It's the white nationalists. It's like Derek Black, who grew up in an entire culture of politics, that we are going to change it, we're going to take it back, and that's what we're about. So this guy, Derek, went to a small liberal arts school in Sarasota, Florida, called New College. And he was very quiet about his background. He didn't talk about it. But he was also famous. He was the protege of the alt-right movement. He was being groomed. He had a radio show. He was very vocal. He was out there. He was the guy that was going to lead them forward. But he went to school and he didn't really talk about it. But he was eventually outed by some students who heard his radio show, and they started to post about him on the forum at the school, and he got ostracized. Like, nobody wanted to talk to him. But this Jewish guy in his dorm, he was an Orthodox Jew. His name was Matthew Swanson. So he was having Friday night Shabbat at his home with a bunch of diverse group of kids, Jews and non-Jews. And he invited Derek Black and said, you know, we're going to invite him. We're going to open our homes to him, open our dinner to him. We're not going to confront him about politics. We're going to just talk with him. And so he never had gotten invited to a social event before. So he decides he'll go to this dinner. And so he goes and he finds people nice. They're just talking about whatever college kids talk about, not politics. And then he came back the next week, the next week, the next week. And finally they started to confront him, to question him, to debate with him. And he came out last summer and he renounced his entire political views of his family, and it was really hard for him to do. I want to read what he said. He actually sent us, the way he did it was he sent a statement to the Southern Poverty Law Center instead of just calling his family like, hey, I'm about to do this. His dad saw this statement. It said, I can't support a movement that tells me I can't be a friend to whoever I wish, or that other people's races require me to think of them in a certain way or be suspicious of their advancements. And so he said, I denounce this. I'm done with it. I haven't been able to do it because I love my family, I respect my family, and especially my dad. So he's tried to repair his family relations since then, but I think that's just a sign that, like, you can't. It's a very hopeful story that this sort of hate and racism can't survive in an atmosphere of education and connection. And so what can we all do to open our hearts, open our homes, have the difficult conversations that we've been resisting having with our own families and in our own communities? Thank you. That's all.